Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Happy Friday. So this is an NCSL webinar. It's part of our Hot Topics in 2015 series. And this is the criminal justice installment, which is body-worn cameras for police officers. So just two brief introductions. You'll be hearing from two people today. First, myself, Rich Williams. I'm in the criminal justice program for NCSL out here in Denver, part of the state Policy Research Division. You'll also be hearing from my counterpart in Washington, D.C., Susan Frederick. She's the Senior Federal Affairs Counsel for NCSL's Law, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety Committee. And so say hi, Susan.
Everyone, good morning.
Okay, so let's jump right into it, and I'll tell you briefly why we chose, us here in criminal justice chose body-worn cameras as the hot topic we're going to talk to you about today. So, as you can see, these represent the current enactments that existed on body-worn cameras up through the end of 2014, and there's not a ton. You had this Oklahoma law which addressed sort of open records requests, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later, and how that impacts information taken from body-worn cameras. Pennsylvania had passed a law that allowed their waterway and conservation officers to wear body cameras, but it didn't have any kind of a mandate. And then Vermont issued a study on their use in conjunction with officers who had electronic control devices, tasers, stun guns, however you want to call them. There's a few other ones out there that you can construe that are sort of related to it, like New Jersey has one that requires all their cars to have cameras with any new car purchases or repairs. I think that actually starts or goes into effect next month. And I think in terms of that, a body-worn camera would satisfy that requirement, but it's not specific to that technology itself. But if you look at what's been going on so far just this year in 2015 sessions, these are the states that currently have pending legislation. These numbers are updated on Monday of this week, and so we had 29 states that are looking at 84 bills. It's moving so fast that this map's already out of date. Iowa yesterday or the day before introduced another piece of legislation, so we're up to 30 bills. And that's one thing I want to point out about what we're going to be talking about today. Most of the information we're going to be looking at is pending legislation, so it's not enactments. It could change as we're doing this. So if you're looking at this on a recorded version, just make sure that the bills that we're referencing are the versions of in that date or time frame. And I just want to remind you, too, since most of this is going to be looking at how states are proposing to answer a lot of the policy questions around body cameras, please remember to submit your questions as we go along in the question and answer box, because we'll have time at the end to answer your questions that way. All right, so before we get into what's actually in the legislation currently on body cameras, we'll take a step back and just tell you where the conversation on body cameras is coming from. As everybody knows, there's been a lot of coverage over the last year and high-profile police confrontations with and the deaths of Mike Brown and Eric Gardner. There's also been a number of killings of police officers reported in the news. And these the unrest this has caused and the tensions and the conversations that are resulting from it have definitely drawn the attention of lawmakers at state, federal, and local levels. They're seeking out policies and having conversations on how you build trusting relationships between police and their communities. And the framework, the lens that a lot of those conversations are taking place through are community policing, the ideal, the philosophy of community policing, and that's not a set of policies. That's more of a philosophy on policing, where it relies on proactive partnerships between officers and their communities, and using that to proactively address public safety concerns, more so than just responding to crisis or emergency situations. And also, when you develop those relationships, it helps deal with and address effectively tough situations that do arise. And so to start talking a little bit about how those conversations are taking place, I'll turn it over to Susan for a minute so that she can talk about some of the work at the federal level directed on community policing.
Okay, so the President has convened a White House task force on 21st century policing, and it's a blue ribbon panel of experts in the field who are coming together for a very short period of time to come up with recommendations and best practices going forward on this issue. As you can see, it was created in December. Their final report is due at the end of March, so they have been very busy having public hearings and taking a lot of testimony from people all over the country that they feel have some contributions to make on this subject. One of the primary things that they will discuss or examine is how to foster a better relationship and a stronger relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they protect, while also promoting effective crime reduction. They are committed to a transparent process, so they've been having public listening sessions which anyone can tune into and listen to, and also they are allowing the public to comment on any of the ideas that are raised or the testimony that is taken during these events. The President himself would like to invest in the purchase of body-worn cameras as a partnership effort between states and the federal government and localities, and I'll discuss the funding issues later, but this is primarily seen as an accountability tool. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. The task force will also look at reforming what types and if local governments should receive military-style equipment. They have taken testimony from communities that do have body camera programs in place. The major themes of the commission going forward are fourfold. Law enforcement training is top on the list. They are looking at the idea that all police departments should have detailed guidelines on the use of force and respectful treatment of citizens, which kind of gets into the community policing issues as well as some of the racial profiling issues that have come up. Racial profiling, of course, is another issue that has been raised during these hearings, and the transparency issue that I already spoke to. And their end goal is to build the public trust, to come up with a national strategy in which we can all live with.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Oops, sorry, went one ahead too far there. Similar conversations are happening around the country at the state and local level. One example I wanted to point out, because it's been, I guess, featured more prominently in the national media, is the Ohio Task Force on Community Policing. It was started by a governor executive order, but there was also a bill proposed to accomplish the same task. There's a number of legislative participants currently on the task force, and they're doing a lot of their work is mirroring much of the effort that Susan just discussed on the federal level. And so out of those conversations, out of these lawmakers and experts in the field coming together and sharing their ideas, you've been getting a number of different policy choices emerging. Some of them Susan already mentioned, like legitimacy and bias training. There's been some effort to improve the type of statistics that are kept on policing initiatives, like community time rather than just a number of arrests and things like that, changing the way that investigations into police-involved deaths are handled. But the one that we've seen most frequent and most prominently featured this year so far in pending legislation has been targeted at the body camera issue, which again is why we chose that as your hot topic to learn about and hopefully unpack some information for you here today. Okay, so jumping in, this sort of lays the groundwork for what legislators are considering in terms of the pros and cons, benefits and concerns related to implementing body-worn camera policies. I think the biggest benefit is that it's more objective evidence than just a he said, she said situation. If you have it on video, you get a little bit of a clearer picture of what happened. It's still not, it's not perfect, but it's better than just individual accounts and testimony. That's backed by, some of the information there is backed by promising studies that have taken place in a number of municipalities that have put programs out. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Cost and funding for this, like where do you find the money to pay for the equipment and deal with the data maintenance and storage. Privacy concerns, these cameras. I think people are used to seeing police dash cam video, but these cameras have the ability to go into people's homes, see demonstrations, affiliations, public association type groupings, get-togethers. So there's a lot more questions popping up with that. And then IT capacity, IT capability. What do states have the ability to store and maintain themselves in terms of the recorded information, or what outside contracting are they doing to try to figure out where to put this information once they have it. So I'll just talk briefly about what some of those studies that have happened on body worn cameras have been finding. The preeminent one, and also I should mention, all of the information that we talk about and mention, we have a website that I'll show you later where you can find this information so you can get direct links to these studies, but I'll just give you a brief overview of them now. The preeminent study so far on body-worn cameras was done by Rialto, California Police Department, and what they found was that when officers wore the cameras, it helped to significantly reduce situations in which police use force, but it also dramatically reduced civilian complaints against police officers. And what they found was that it was somewhere north of 80% where complaints against police officers dropped, and it was a 60% reduction in police use of force incidents. And Phoenix, Arizona had a similar study, had similar results, and many other municipalities in 2015 have already started implementing pilot projects, and whatever data they gather, I think, will hash out what the benefits of, or what the perceived and continued study on body camera benefits are, and either enforce that or go in the other direction depending upon what they find. Some of those you can look at New York, Chicago, and Seattle, for example, and a number of small municipalities across the country. Okay, so this is just a quick snapshot of the kind of questions that are being answered in the body-worn camera legislation that we're going to go through now. Here's just so you have a one-off slide for that, and you can see the kind of things that we're going to touch on as we go. So the biggest, or the first place, and the best place to start, I would say, is what the legislation describes as who is put in charge of developing the standards for those different topics. Some of the bills, and for each of these different things, I've given you an example of where you can find language, and that's what the bill number is in parentheses, and all this stuff is current pending legislation. So like I said before, it could change, but it's there for a textual example if you're interested. Some of the bills are more prescriptive directly in them, like this Maryland bill, and it identifies retention standards, who needs to wear them, what kind of who has access to review, what kind of video needs to be maintained, things like that. Other bills charge either a state agency or individual agencies to do those kind of things, and that's listed here. And some of those are more lax in their overall requirements. They'll just say these are the people in charge of it. Other ones will set minimum standards for if this agency or this police department sets forth standards, they have to address X, Y, and Z in it. And some of the agencies that have been being tapped, I think the Illinois one there is the Department of State Police. Virginia has one that puts their criminal justice, Division of Criminal Justice Services, Office of Public Safety. So it's those type of organizations that are being, or agencies that are being charged with coming up with standards for this. And a lot of them are, that's also the kind of stuff you can find in those reports. Like I know Rialto's standards for body cameras have been used and borrowed by a number of other agencies across the country that have been interested in body-worn cameras. So the next thing I want to touch on is who wears them. And this is a lot of legislation sort of all across the board on how many officers in the state are wearing them. The first one I want to point out, which I guess is the furthest in one direction, is a number of bills that would require every police officer in the state to wear a body-worn camera. I think a step back from that there's a number of different ways they say this. Officers who interact with the public need to wear body cameras, and they'll say things like if it's a regular part of your job to conduct traffic stops, or respond to emergencies, then you need to wear a body camera. And I think the point of that is to reduce the paperwork channel of body camera video that would exist if you're just sitting at your desk writing all day. It might not necessarily be the most important thing to have recorded on video. There's also states that are figuring out pilot programs. New York had an interesting one. It was for cities over a certain population over the next several years, higher and higher percentages of the precincts within their jurisdiction would have to start implementing body camera programs. And so the cost and other considerations with that would rise year by year as more and more officers were required to use body cameras. Minnesota actually has a pending bill that would put a moratorium body-worn cameras, and I think that's so that they can, like the idea behind that is that they would have more information collected, they would have a better understanding of the pros and cons of different implementation strategies. One thing that's not on, one bill that's not on here, and I wanted to mention because I thought it was also interesting, Missouri has I want to say 2 or 3 bills actually, that would prohibit a state agency from requiring every law enforcement officer in the state to have a body camera. They could still do it voluntarily, but it would be a legislative prohibition against widespread requirements. And then sort of related to that is when body cameras should be turned on, and then the next slide deals with when they should be turned off. And sort of the balancing of considerations here are really, I mean, there's situations where officers are voicing concern about having on camera, like talking to a confidential informant, or maybe a victim who just went through a sexual assault, those kind of things. But there's also, on the other side of that, there was a study done out of LA County Jail. It was used in a controlled setting. They said that one of the challenges with the particular equipment they used was that in emergency situations, it was tough to remember to turn on their body camera, which in that case was a double push of a button and a hold. But there's different technologies out there, and so that sort of depends on the particular type, the particular contract and equipment that particular agency has. And so here's some other ways that when legislation saying that body cameras should be turned on. Some are just as broad as during any interaction with the public. So anytime an officer is talking to somebody who's not, a supervisor or a colleague, they have to turn on their body camera. There's also ones that get into much more specific situations, like this Texas bill, which is requiring the body cameras to be turned on during an arrest, during a chase, responding to a call, and traffic stops is a really common one across the current body of legislation that's out there. And so moving on to what's in legislation as far as when body cameras can be turned off. So, and this one, sorry to laugh, but it just makes me chuckle a little bit. There's some that are described as personal actions by police officers. And so you've seen like things like bathroom breaks and personal calls being allowed to where the camera is enabled to be turned off. This Arizona bill has a provision for when a person requests it who is not involved as a criminal suspect. They list out things like some of the stuff I mentioned before, like a victim or a witness who is not a suspect and who doesn't want to be on camera. And then this will lead into the next kind of issue that we're talking about, is the request of a property owner. So if in a non-emergency situation, the cop goes to enter somebody's house, they would announce that they have their body camera on, and that if the owner doesn't want them to have it on, they can turn it off. But most legislation that has some kind of requirement where both that interaction happens while the camera's on, so that that's known as the reason why it's being turned off. And so just to talk about that a little more in terms of privacy considerations, and I just touched on some of this stuff. So recording in private places is one of the bigger concerns of this, because in terms of what people are used to, body cameras are more invasive. So there's different provisions and standards for going into somebody's house or other private area and recording. This Maryland bill specifically addressed protests and demonstrations and religious gatherings, that if there was no criminal activity going on, police were prohibited from using them to film those kind of things, so that they can associate, so that basically to keep people from collecting information on association. And then another way that they're addressing in terms of when people want, or to make people aware that they're being filmed, is to announce that the recording is taking place. And that touches on an aspect that I don't have on the slides, but I just wanted to mention briefly. For some states with eavesdropping laws, I think in the majority of states, it's sort of one-way allowance if a recording's happening of a conversation, that you can that you're allowed to tape it. And so presumably there it would be the officer acknowledging that they have the ability to record the conversation. But numbers have two-way and all-party consent laws, and in those states, there's an example that in this law existed, I think, previously from related to dash cam recordings. New Hampshire has a law that would put in an exemption to their all-party consent eavesdropping law, that police video recording law, that police video recordings were they were just an exception to the eavesdropping law, so that they could be recorded. And then some of the other stuff that comes up in terms of privacy are the use of the footage for additional, or the application of additional technologies or resources with the footage, such as facial recognition technology, or cutting the video together to use them to create mugshots or lineups is also something that's being addressed here and there throughout the legislation. The next issue I want to talk about is the data retention standards, which is one of the big questions for state legislatures as they're putting out these standards or requiring different agencies to make some of their standards. What are the types of incidents that are worthy of being saved, and how long do they keep information that is not? A lot of that has to do with time, so I've seen it range from anywhere to 30 to 90 days, or even shorter time frames where they'll have to review material before it's deleted. So a lot of times what will make something be stored longer has to do with whether or not it's part of a pending complaint against an officer or a pending crime. A number of states are also considering bills that would have the video could be saved at the request of the officer involved or the request of anybody who's shown in the video, and that would extend the period up till I've seen it 3 years, or just the length of whatever complaint that they end up filing. Another one of the big issues that's come up is justification for failing to record in situations where the police officer was meant to record. And here, South Carolina, the South Carolina bill has some circumstances that would be justified, and what that basically boils down to is equipment malfunction or an emergency situation where they didn't have the opportunity to turn their camera on. Just recently in the news, there was a dash cam, I think it was in St. Louis, where officers were in the middle of arresting somebody and they turned the camera off. And so the contention there from the police department is that even when the camera was turned off, they didn't do anything wrong. But there's still a number of legislators and legislatures out there that are concerned about those situations, because even if you didn't do anything wrong, turning something off in the middle of a difficult situation has the appearance that something might have been done wrong. And the legislative response to that has been including what's been called the deleted video presumption. And that's a challenging thing, because basically what that means is if there is a video that should exist but it does not exist, the accounts of the suspect or whoever is contesting the officer's accounts are taken as true. And I don't know how, one of the questions is, I guess, how far that could be pushed and what level of their account would be taken as true. But those two bills are examples of where that presently exists. Another aspect of data retention that these proposals are looking at is how they should be reviewed and what should be the process for deciding what needs to be retained and what doesn't need to be retained. And so the Kansas bill that I have listed there has specific procedures for whoever the staff is that reviews it for when it must be kept and when it can't be kept, and they're charged with figuring that out. New Hampshire has a piece of legislation that actually it addresses that they don't have the current staffing levels to do those sorts of activities, so it factored in the hiring of a new paralegal in their legislative proposal in order to meet the needs of those duties. And then the last thing I want to mention on this particular topic is that there's also a number of bills that are considering how officers can review their own information before they write their police reports. And there's some concern there about what you'd be able to account for and say based on, poring over a piece of video to pull out every possible thing you could see versus what you'd be able to remember just off of your encounter. And so the type of access that's allowable prior to reports and after complaints, that's also stuff that's being considered in these pieces of legislation. But I'd like to turn it over to Susan for a moment just to talk about some of the federal thoughts, conversations, and considerations on data retention policies for body cameras.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. The FBI has some standards in place that address the issue of data retention and the sharing of files between levels of law enforcement personnel. And it will be interesting to see if, the body-worn cameras are something that sort of become the norm for police on the street, how that issue of data retention will square with federal regulations. They're very specific as to, you know, the types or how storage will occur, the criteria for exemptions, and all of that. But when these were drafted, I don't believe it was contemplated that this would be the norm for law enforcement. It really was directed more toward criminal records review, and how and when, you know, you could, or how long and how you would store, you know, criminal history and the sharing between federal and state and local law enforcement. So these things will all have to be re-examined, I think, if the trend is toward these body-worn cameras and the storage issue does become something that will need to be discussed further.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that continues to develop once they get more and bigger bodies of this information. The next thing next aspect I want to touch on, and this, I guess, more, we talked a little bit about the privacy considerations from, I guess, the public's side of things. These touch more on some of the officer concerns they have about having such a large amount of information, video and audio information recorded on their day-to-day activities. And the first one, I guess, would be considered, or it has been considered a benefit, is that when you have this video, you get real-life versions of situations that are difficult in addressing. So you have training that would be available from these situations for your new recruits or for continued education for police officers. And in particular, I believe it's the Arizona bill I have listed there, addresses that video could specifically be stored in situations where officers dealt with crisis intervention situations, which deal with suspects or people in the public that are having mental health problems, and to show officers the appropriate way to address and train them to deal with those situations. Also, a different aspect of training I wanted to mention is the added cost that would be incurred by a lot of places that are requiring their officers to go through trainings on how to use their body cameras. So that's what's included in that Texas bill currently that I have listed up there. Another concern is how these videos would be used for officer discipline. For example, this Indiana bill talks about if a minor infraction is witnessed by an officer on their screen, that it would be used as a teaching situation until it occurs some number of times, and then corrective, more disciplinary action could be taken. It does provide, though, that if something is blatantly criminal, that immediate action would be taken against the officer. The Missouri bill there, I wanted to put that one up there because that's one of those that where the legislature sort of charges another agency with figuring out aspects of what their standards should look like, and within there is figuring out what a requirement that there needs to be figured out what disciplinary actions and what the disciplinary structure should look like as a result of what's caught on video. Another funny thing, I guess, that's been making its way around the internet on this, and you can see how it would be different in a serious situation, but it does, with the amount of information that would be collected on officers, you could see the concern for minor infractions being held against them. The Taylor Swift cop in Dover, Delaware, rocking out to her song has become sort of a national thing, but you can picture other embarrassing aspects they would be concerned with being caught on camera. And that's moving on to this Mississippi bill we have here, dealing with the statistics of how the video is going to be used. In their proposal, they would track measurables in terms of, you know, how much video is used in complaints against officers, how much is used in court proceedings, what types of things are being caught on video, and I think that that's kind of an emerging world for this body of information, is when it's broken down into statistics and how agencies and states use that moving forward to thinking about making decisions in terms of what is and is not effective. Okay, and then the next thing I wanted to talk about a bit is open records laws and their impact on body-worn camera information. So basically, open records are the public's ability to get access to government records that deal with the normal course of doing the public's business. And so the legislation and the law that exists on this goes sort of two ways. They either declare in the beginning it is a record or it is not a record, but for in certain circumstances. The Oklahoma statute that was enacted in 2014 would make it a public record, but it would enable, before being released, to redact portions that depict somebody's death or dead body, nudity, or the identity of, I think it's kids under 16 years old. And here's some of the things that are also being considered in pending legislation. This Oregon one, I've seen it in a number. This provision I've seen in a number of other pieces of legislation, that they're exempt from the open record laws unless force is used in the video. So in the most critical situations, or the ones that would be open to the most scrutiny, those would be considered public records. And then North Dakota has one that would just exempt anything that takes place in a house or other private area from being considered public record. And there's been some concern on this in terms of how much or how little is released in terms of that impact on data security, in terms of how these things are stored. The appearance of transparency when you release more information versus wanting to keep some things that are hard, like the death of somebody, or if somebody's naked, potentially embarrassing, things like that. But if people feel like it's being done in a lack of transparency, there might be more of an effort to attack those secured data areas, and that has been part of the conversation there and part of the concern. And then there's also been a couple of places that just want to figure out more information and get as much together as they can before they start to implement policies on body-worn cameras. Here's some study committee language that you can find. From Arizona, that's just a general body camera study. The Indiana bill goes a lot more in depth into, or wants to go a lot more in depth to the open records considerations that need to be addressed. And also, I've mentioned the New York pilot program before, and a couple of other places are looking at that too for specific municipalities like Connecticut mentioned here. And so now I'd like to give Susan an opportunity to talk a little bit about what's happening in pending federal legislation on the body camera issue.
So, despite all of the state activity, there's only been one really on-point federal piece of legislation, and it's been a lot more comprehensive than just body cameras. The bill is H.R. 103. It's the Shield Our Streets Act of 2015, introduced primarily by Congressman Conyers from Michigan, and sponsored by a host of other Democratic congressmen. It is not a bipartisan bill. It is not. It does not have a Senate counterpart as of yet. And you can see there that what the general thrust of the legislation is: enhanced training through the COPS office. It's a much broader bill than just dealing with body cameras. It also provides grants to states and localities to buy equipment, to enhance public defenders programs, to install street lamps specifically to deter crime, and other measures that are proven to deter crime, and to fund public safety programs and make infrastructure improvements, also with the goal of decreasing crime and improving public safety. And finally, it also provides, with this grant money, that states and localities could use some funding to fund crime labs, which would help with prosecution. So again, this would take away a little bit from, and in contrast to the President's proposal, where I mentioned earlier there would be a partnership effort between the federal government and local government, including states. The President's proposal contemplates a 50% match. This bill would not require any state or local match on the funding, so it would be an outright, grant to states and localities for these purposes.
All right, thank you, Susan. Mm-hmm. Next, we're going to talk about, and I would say this is probably what I get the most questions on concerning body-worn cameras, is how much do they cost, and what are the thoughts on funding these programs. Susan mentioned before a lot of the stuff, and she'll talk more about it in a minute, what's happening federally. But first, I just want to go over a few of what the sort of most typical costs associated with body-worn cameras are. I wanted to break them down into two kind of distinct things: the first-year cost and the ongoing cost. First year is usually higher based on you obviously need to purchase the cameras themselves and other equipment. And then after that, it's the maintenance of those equipment, replacement of the equipment, training of the officers, data storage, retrieval, training people to do that. And like I mentioned, that New Hampshire bill before, the potential hiring of new staff to have to do that. And so I've seen ranges based on municipal accountings and some fiscal note accountings of what this would cost to implement in a first year per officer basis. And those numbers I've seen anywhere from like $315 to $1,500. And a lot of that is based on fluctuating factors. Some of them I've listed here, like the number of police officers you plan on using cameras for, the amount of data. So like if it's on during your entire shift, or if it's only on in certain situations, I think that's probably the difference of terabytes and terabytes of data. Whether or not you're storing the information internally, or whether or not you're using a third-party vendor to house that information. Those are a lot of the factors that go into figuring out what the exact cost is. Again, the website I'll show you in a minute. We have some of the studies and some of the cost factors that have been put together on that issue by municipalities. And the longer and the more developed the pilot programs that are going on now exist, that information I think will get better and better and more refined. So next, here's just some of the ways I've seen in pending legislation that states are looking at attempting to cover the costs here. California has a bill that would use some general fund money. Part of that's tied in with some of the federal resources Susan's going to be talking about in a minute. They have sort of a state locality matching program that would partner with partner that way with what would be provided or what could be provided federally. New Hampshire has a bill that would add a dollar surcharge to every civil and criminal fine in the state and pay for it that way. And that bill is sort of interesting because it sort of goes through, has one of the more comprehensive cost breakdowns that I've seen out of the pending legislation that's out there. A couple of places, actually a lot of municipalities that have put out reports, and it existed in a couple of other places in the current state pending legislation, is that the use of forfeiture funds in order to try to pay for body cameras, and that's proceeds that are attached to criminal activity that law enforcement agencies confiscate in the course of those actions. Indiana's bill would, in particular, directed their law enforcement agencies to use community-oriented policing services, the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office at the federal level, funding they get from them in order to purchase body cameras. This Tennessee bill I thought was interesting because they didn't put a requirement on their officers to get them, but they said that these programs should be put in place contingent upon these outside sources of available funding that I have listed there. Georgia, this Georgia bill also had, along with their standards, they said they would withhold state funding contingent upon if an agency failed to use or failed to comply with the standards for when they're supposed to be on or data retention, they would take funding away. And then finally, Missouri has two different bills that address the use of additional sales tax to pay for body-worn cameras. The first one there, HB 75, addresses the purchase of guns or ammunition, and the second one's on real property. And they listed a bunch. I think motorboats was one of the types of property that they included in there, but it's just various real property purchases. And so with that, that's sort of an overview of what's happening at the state level. I'll turn it back over to Susan to talk a bit about some of the federal ideas for funding on body cameras.
Okay, so the White House proposed its budget back at the beginning of the month. And of course, this is not a final budget. It will have to go through both houses of Congress, the Appropriations Committee in each chamber, the House and the Senate. It will then probably go to conference because I don't know that the House and Senate will pass identical versions of this bill. So this is in the very, very early stages. I just want to make sure that that's really clear. So the numbers will likely change, but the President has proposed $77 million for a community policing initiative, of which $30 million is dedicated to a body-worn camera partnership program. In this partnership program, it contemplates a 50% match for states and localities for the purchase of body-worn cameras and the requisite storage. So it is unclear whether it would be a formula grant or whether this would be a competitive grant. The trend is away from formula grants at the federal level and more toward competitive, but we would need to wait and see how that plays out. The initiative, the bigger number, the budget proposal of $77 million, is to really support smart policing efforts, body-worn cameras for law enforcement, and building trust between the community and law enforcement, which has a dedicated $20 million toward that goal. It also provides $12 million for research to identify the causes of and to counter domestic radicalization as a part of the administration's Countering Violent Extremism initiative. And in addition to the dedicated or specific funding for body cameras and related activities, there is additional funding available for the community policing program which is under the COPS grant, which this year the President is proposing $303.5 million. And again, that number will either rise or fall depending on congressional priorities and whether they, how the money will end up being allocated will remain to be seen.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Next, I just want to point out some of the other resources we have available on not just the body camera issue, but on policing issues generally. We have a Hot Topics page on our website. You can see the direct link provided below here, and this is a screenshot of it. And you can also just find it by doing an internet search for NCSL, criminal justice, hot topics, law enforcement, something like that, and it'll pop up. But the body camera information is being kept there along with the other policy options that are emerging as a result of these community policing type discussions. We're also having this year at our legislative summit in Seattle, Washington, August 3rd through the 6th, we're going to have a session on policing that will feature in some respect the body camera issues. And by then there'll be more, likely be more enactments, and so get a sense of which way the enacted versus pending legislation is heading. And so with that, I would like to open it up to the questions that are being submitted. And the first one is, I will field here, I guess, is something for Susan. Somebody's asking about a little more specific information on the COPS funding and what that's available to be used for, and how it can be used either towards body cameras or training.
Thank you, Rich. The COPS money is generally geared toward hiring and training law enforcement personnel. It was put into place many years ago to promote the hiring and to help pay for the hiring of new police officers, and this is a local funding stream. States do not get COPS money. It is the only direct funding stream from the federal government that goes directly to local jurisdictions. We appreciate that funding, though, obviously, because when localities receive COPS money, they aren't asking states to help fund, to help pay for all of the law enforcement personnel that they want to hire for that given time period. Along with the hiring money, there's also availability under the COPS program for equipment and training of those law enforcement officers. So obviously training would mean, police academy work or whatever in the field training they need to do to accomplish their goals as police officers to serve and protect. Also, equipment could be anything from bulletproof vests to body cameras. So the administration is making it very clear that along with the dedicated funding that I mentioned earlier for body cameras, that if localities wanted to use some of their COPS funding for the purchase of body camera equipment, they could do so as a authentic purpose of that program.
Okay, thank you. The next question has to do with asking about whether or not there are cost-positive aspects of using body-worn cameras, and I'm not aware of like statistical information on this, but as the argument goes, it's that there's X number of dollars that are spent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction on resolving police use of force incident complaints or police brutality complaints, and the investigation and the money that goes into investigating those. I would think that localities would have a better understanding of what their annual cost output on that is per year, and given the reductions in use of force incidents by police officers and sort of the more objective evidence, it seems like it would follow that would have some impact, but I don't know. I mean, it's something that there's not. I don't believe that there is good current statistical information on. But it should, but that is something to look at and to consider. Okay, this question's asking about so I mentioned before that there were facial recognition technology was one of the concerns that people were worried about in terms of using on the stuff that was using on the information generated from body-worn camera videos. And so what's the feasibility of that? I don't know how effective facial recognition technology is. I know that it was used during the Boston bombing thing, so it is a resource that is available to criminal justice personnel and practitioners. But it definitely is a real concern. I remember a local story here a few years ago where there was some sort of marijuana rally in Boulder, and police were using Facebook and other cameras to identify, find, and track down people who were at that in order to give them summons. I think that was specifically people who were using drugs on camera, but that's, I think, where that concern stems from. And so there definitely is the ability to use these things on there, so that is a valid consideration. The next question I have is, has there been pushback from police unions or other national law enforcement groups on this? And I guess the answer there is it's mixed. And I've heard it relayed to me by a few different chiefs of police that it seems to be following the same trend that there was on dash cams initially. You know, there is definitely a concern about being recorded all the time, but in many situations, officers also feel like it shows to exonerate them more quickly. And that's what I would say is that the higher level police, so like chief level officers I've talked to, seem to be more in favor of it that way. But there has definitely been some consideration and some pushback on, you know, like the sort of entire shift policies of having to be recorded. Susan, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think with respect to the national law enforcement groups, like the National Sheriff's Association or the big city chiefs, this issue is rather new, and we have not heard of any national association of law enforcement folks that have actually passed any policy one way or the other on this. I would assume that it will come up within the memberships of those organizations, and that, you know, based on their policy calendar when they do their work, we may or may not see consensus reached within those national groups. But as of now, I don't know that there's any national group out there that has adopted a formal policy one way or the other on the issue.
Thank you. The next question we have is on it's sort of a related topic. How is the citizens' ability to record police officers, how is that impacting this conversation? That's been sort of a weird one. I think the basic consensus on that is that citizens are allowed to record officers in the performance of their duties as long as it doesn't interfere with some kind of criminal justice purpose. I guess the concern there has been more towards people getting arrested even though they have the legal right to do it. So I've seen some pending bills out there that deal with providing enhanced punishment for officers who arrest people in those situations. But nothing has been enacted on that so far. Do you have anything else for that, Susan, or have you heard anything federally on the recording of law enforcement by the public?
No, we have not. I know that the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the end of next week is going to be hosting a 2-day comprehensive discussion on the issue of body cameras. I'm assuming all of these things that we've talked about today will come up. It's a multi-agency, multi-staff endeavor. So I'm assuming that you know, they'll address all of these issues at that time.
Gotcha. Okay, the next question we have, okay, I see. It deals with, so before I mentioned that there were, as part of the community policing initiative, one of the things that's coming out of it are ways to use better statistics. So the question is, what are better statistics? And I think that people are trying to figure that out now. I believe the National Academy of Sciences has some research going on in terms of how to quantify what would be, rather than like arrest rates, something along the lines of community time, how to value that in a police officer's job, how they're interacting with their community, how they're participating in these different programs that engage with either engage with youth or just the communities that they live in. And that's, yeah, those are sort of where the efforts are on that now. There's also been pushback, and there's been some discussion lately at the highest levels involving how statistics on officer-involved deaths are taken. And I think right now the way that that's done is mostly voluntarily. And there have been some comparative reports where it put like the number at what was being published federally was like something about 400, and just through reviews of different news stories or something, the number was in excess of 1,000. So there's some discrepancies that's happening, and I know a few states have taken action on figuring out or requiring those types of statistics, any police officer involved death, to be collected, reported, and filed. So yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting area for this as it develops, is how and what kind of statistics are seen as valuable uses of police work, and how that changes from sort of what's been the more standard things kept previously. Have you heard anything on that aspect, Susan, in terms of federally and looking into how statistics are being collected and used and shared?
No, I think most of that activity, Rich, has been at the state level at this point. I have not been privy to any of those conversations. I haven't been asked the question either. So I think we're just going to have to see what this convening of folks next week will hold for that question as well.
Okay. And it looks like we have one more question, so if anybody else has another one after that, just please type it in, or else this will be it. They're asking about how this type of video could impact employment and disciplinary decisions. I talked a little bit about that before, but I know a number of states have something along the lines in place of like a police officer's Bill of Rights in terms of what they have access to and what's confidential information while their job status is in jeopardy. And so something that might be available under the Open Records Law would have a conflict with what would be accessible if it's potential disciplinary action could be taken on an officer. I don't have a great answer for that at the moment, because there hasn't. I don't know of where that's come into play. But as this policy develops, I'm sure there'll be more on that coming forward. Just as more information is collected and more information is taken. I have a question that's specific to, and I believe if I'm reading it right, the usage, a comprehensive statewide usage policy. And I guess there's two ways that I could take that, so I'll answer them both ways. If you mean usage of the equipment themselves, there are other states that have in their bill that every officer in the state would have to use body cameras. If you mean it in terms of usage of the data to be shared against or to be purchased from the company that would be doing it, I don't think that has been worked out yet, because I don't know that in a number of states it leaves it up to the locality who they make their contract with. And that I think more of that information would probably be best available from the companies themselves, because they know who they have contracts with and what their different sizes of your agencies are and how that would compare and how that would impact the cost and retrieval. I would imagine things moving that way just for the sake of standardization. If that answered your question, let me know. I can definitely look and see if there are other bills out there that directly address the statewide use policy, and I can talk to you more if you shoot me an email at the thing there, or give me a call, and definitely talk to you more about the different concerns. But I would think that the more people you include under the same contract, the more cost savings you probably realize as an entity. There's another question about Has any legislation addressed whether or not the video should be stored and publicly available online? There are some bills that address the direct release, sort of in addition to those open records requests that I was talking about before. But I believe most of those are targeted at people who are actually in the video. So if your identity was revealed, or if you're the attorney for a person, if you're the attorney for the person who is depicted in the video, you can get a direct request for the video and it'll be released to you. I've seen some website requirements in terms of making the policies behind all this publicly available, but I don't know of any state that has currently where the video would just be stored, housed, and searchable online. I also don't know what the IT impact of that would be, to just have an online, like basically another YouTube. The next question we have is, do any states contemplate using private vendors of videos, vendors for storing the video? And yeah, I think that seems to be, especially from a lot of the municipal reports, the way a lot of them are leaning. I know that currently the Seattle pilot program that they've just kicked off is actually doing an equipment and cost comparison. So they have like 2 different segments of time where they'll be using cameras and data storage from what would be, I guess, considered, from what their names come up the most, the 2 leading companies on the issue, and they have that housed differently, and I think they're always working to try to figure out the best way to do that. But yeah, there has been some. I would say that's where most of the videos are being looked at to be stored, is on private third-party vendor servers and like cloud platforms, rather than in-house. If you're interested in looking at some of those, I think one of the ones is called evidence.com, so you can look at that. I've seen that in a number of municipal reports in terms of how they store and access video there. Okay, I think that's we've hit our full time, and so Susan, unless you have anything to add there, I'll just sign off and say thank you to everybody for joining us. Again, you can reach us at any of these various contact ways here, and be happy to share or talk about this stuff anytime, because it is immensely interesting to me, and it seems to be changing by the day.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, and have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.